Welcome to the 7th presentation in the series where we're looking at the logic of Christianity. In the last presentation we looked at contributions from the major religions present in the world today. In this presentation we're going to be looking at suffering. We touched upon it and the contributions other religions have made. So for example, Buddhism thinks that all life just involves suffering and pain, which is true. Recognizes its source, but thinks that we can overcome it, and lays out some procedures so that we can, as it were, almost remove suffering. If only life were that simple. Christianity sees it as inevitable. We've been given freedom of choice. We can free to make mistakes and mess up. But God can take the mess that we can make of things, which is sometimes dreadful, and He can transform us and intervene in wonderful ways. Hinduism puts forward the idea that its religion and spiritual practices are kind of resources. It allows us to cope with the kind of chronic pain of suffering in the world around, but the ultimate goal is absorption in deity. Kind of wishful thinking. But Islam, as usual, has the simplest picture. It's just simply seen as the will of God, Allah, not to be questioned. That's a kind of hopeless fatalism when we think about it. Similarly, the four major religious groups also have ideas about the origin of evil in the world today. So, for example, Buddhism doesn't separate good and evil too neatly, although it does recognize that evil is when we humans pursue our own self-interest. And that's true. Christianity sees freedom of choice given to spiritual beings, angels, and to us. That's where evil originates. We can choose the wrong way. Freedom opens the possibility of making wrong choices. That's always going to be true. But if you think about it, if you don't have that freedom, then we don't have relationship and we don't have love. Because these things are entered into by choices. Choices that we're free to make. We're not just ruled by instincts. In the origins of evil, Hinduism just sees this in terms of human free will, and it's inevitable. Probably true. Islam, it accepts the existence of evil spiritual beings. And in the Quran it sees their nature in terms of Satan. Satan, the Hebrew word for adversary. Satan, an angel, failing to bow down to humankind. And as a result of this, God allows him to tempt humankind. Not quite clear what the explanation is behind that as to why that happened, but it's certainly taught. In Christianity, God's creation is seen as fundamentally good, and that God is separate from His creation. He made it, but He's separate from it. But with the abuse of freedom by ourselves and by angels, things have gone wrong. But it recognizes we're not really capable of putting things right without help. And any look at the history of humankind supports that perception. God has entered the human arena. He came in the life of Jesus. He didn't come with overwhelming force, because that would have destroyed the very nature of us, our free will, because He would be imposing things upon us. He came in the vulnerability of a child, and that speaks volumes of how God reacts. Jesus taught us what life should be like, but He showed us what life should be. He took on the evil in the world. He defeated it. And He invites all of us equally to share with Him in restoring God's creation. That's the logic of Christianity. It's worth pondering this. Jesus was prepared to undergo crucifixion, regarded by those who are experts in the field as perhaps the most vicious and violent form of death by torture that human beings have ever invented. Jesus allowed by his choice himself to go through this, and in the process he robbed evil of its power, exposed the hopelessness of sheer brute violence, cruelty, and making others suffer. And God showed that he'd won the battle by raising him from the dead as a kind of model and template for the rest of humankind. It's worth stopping and pondering the depth of that one sentence. Look out in our world today, children suffering, the tears of a mother, someone waiting to have his head chopped off under Islamic law. That's a real case. Pain and suffering, men being marched off by Islamic extremists, each one to have their throats cut. Slavery is rife in many parts of the world, tragically today, even in the West, where there are floods and earthquakes, but compared to the floods and the earthquakes, the sheer destruction of cities and life by bombs and bullets and violence, far, far greater. Whatever else is true, the world is full of suffering. We see it on our television screens, and our hearts go out to those who are going through the most horrendous experiences, most of which created by other human beings. Suffering? You could describe it that way. If we abuse drugs, we damage our bodies, we suffer later in life. Disease can strike us because we in the West hold far too much food, and obesity is a problem. Throughout much of the world there are children literally starving. Violent storms, sometimes made more violent by our abuse of the planet, causing global warming. Those who get into power in countries and abuse that power and cause terrible, terrible things upon their populations. Well, sometimes there are floods that wash away livelihoods and crops. Earthquakes can cause destruction. But we persecute each other horrendously. We've done it right down through the ages. But today in the world, 80% of the religious persecution is directed at Christians, not at other religious groups. Much of it is directed at Christians by political systems like communism or by other religious groups. While in many countries today, torture in prison is quite common. We have the natural events of volcanic eruptions, and we abuse food and drink, particularly in the West. While we have floods of refugees fleeing the most dreadful conditions, and sometimes we run campaigns in our newspapers saying we won't take them in, and sometimes our governments mandate that refugees who do get in are sent back to their countries, knowing that in these countries they will face persecution, trouble, unfair imprisonment, and possible death. So much of the suffering is caused by us human beings in our selfishness. Yes, there are natural disasters. There are illnesses and diseases that run rife. Though in many cases, humans, we have answers to these, if only we'd share the answers with the developing world. We do abuse our bodies in the way our lifestyles run and what we eat and drink. While the overeating and overdrinking of the West leaves other countries with starvation and deprivation. And how often people, particularly from a political or religious viewpoint, try to impose that on others and then abuse the others who won't conform. And that's seen rampant in totalitarian states, dictatorships, and also in Islamic states, on minorities. The world is full of suffering, but there are different kinds of suffering. Most of it could be resolved. Treat our bodies with respect. A lot of the medical conditions that we face today, we bring on ourselves. We share the world's resources a bit better. We treat each other with respect, even people with whom we disagree. And we treat this planet with respect. We have abused it over most of the history of mankind, but in the last 100 to 150 years we've abused it particularly badly. There are limits to what it can stand. And if we suppress our economic greed, because if we get more, someone else gets less. And much of the medical problems overseas could be assisted greatly if we shared them. It means putting our hands in our pockets because these people can't pay the bills. There are answers if we're prepared to take it. People ask that, why does God allow so much suffering? It's a big question. In a kind of modern way, it's put this way. People say, well, God is omnipotent. If you believe in God, then he is all-powerful. God is good. If God is not good, he's not worth worshipping. Now, if he's omnipotent, people then go on to say he must be able to do anything he wants. If he's good, then he would seek the best for the creatures that he has created, ourselves. The trouble is we look out in our world and we see suffering, illness, pain and natural disasters. And many people say, well, either God isn't omnipotent, he's not all-powerful, or he's not good, maybe he's not either, or maybe there's no God. And they dismiss the whole nature of spirituality and the logic of Christianity. You may have faced that argument, but it's got a fundamental flaw within it. Let's look at that flaw. It centers in that phrase, omnipotent God, all-powerful God. That's the word that poses the problems, because we misunderstand it. Yes, God can do anything, but he cannot and will not do what is contradictory. Contradictory to his own nature, contradictory to what he's already done in his creation, because that denies himself and what he has done. So we've got to watch that word. It's misleading. Doesn't matter how clever you are, you can't make 1 + 1 into 3. You can use different symbols to make it work, but you can't make the reality. These are principles. You can't love someone and hate someone simultaneously. Love can turn into hate and vice versa. And you can't know something and not know something. It's either one or the other. Do you see what it means? Contradictory things. How about this one? This is the key. You can't break the laws of chemistry and physics at will. There are certain laws in which this universe operates. And if we decide to break them at will, well, we'll end up in trouble. You can't just ignore the laws of gravity. You won't survive. But central to it all is that God gave humanity free will, and looking at ourselves, it's obvious we have the capacity to take decisions. It's a mark of being human. We don't just run on instinct. We're not robotic in the way we do things. So God's not going to intervene to contradict that which he has created, our free will. He's not going to deny it. So let's watch that word omnipotent. It's true, but there's a limitation. Think of this. If God kept intervening in the world just to correct all the wrong choices made by you and me, and perhaps by the spirit world of angels and demons, Well, what he would be doing then is effectively taking away from us the key attribute that he's given to us, that makes and marks us out as human beings, that we've got the capacity to take decisions and free will. So there are problems in that. Now think of God continue intervening in the world and altering the way the world works, the physical and biological realms, so that we'd ever damage ourselves. God would be intervening in the way the world has been structured. There'd be no constant way by which it worked. And that would leave a world that was not the world that we know today, and a world in which we'd be living in utter, complete uncertainty. Omnipotence, all power, yes, that's true, but it does not mean God destroying the very nature of his creation or destroying his own nature. It cannot mean that. It's worth pondering that. And the arguments put up before are somewhat superficial and specious. Now, that may look a strange thing. Pain is necessary in the world. In fact, in some cases it's essential. You feel discomfort if you're tired, and that makes you slow down, go to bed. Or an injury, because that gives you a warning to take action which will stop something that will damage us further. How about the pain of self-discipline? We don't like it. We don't want it. It makes us uncomfortable. But that makes us mature as human beings. But how about the pain of imposed discipline? Think of a parent with a child. The young child, perhaps aged 2 or 3, starts to realize that they're independent. They start to impose their way, and their favourite word in English language is no. They go into a realm of disobedience. Parents got to bring some sort of discipline to them. If they don't, that child will move on to be not only a spoilt child, but probably a delinquent teenager. Because that imposed discipline develops a sense of right and wrong. No, you can't do that. That's not a good thing to say, not a good thing to do. It'll hurt you. It'll hurt someone else. And if we don't go down that line, and that can be painful on the child, they don't like it. They stamp their feet. But they have to learn that. So pain in the world is a part of our life, and it's essential, necessary, important. Our actions always have consequences. That has to be learned. The young child has to understand that. The consequences may arise from the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, but there's also the consequences arising from human reactions to what we're doing. That if one child treats another child particularly badly, they may get retaliation, and if the other child is bigger and stronger, they may suffer considerably. We have to learn actions have consequences, and that's true all the way through life. It seems in our modern media of films, it's perfectly possible for couples to slip into bed with each other whenever, without any consequences. But there are consequences, that it may generate a pregnancy. But it will generate a relationship between these two people that, if not able to be pursued later on, may damage both of them when they enter other relationships. Actions have consequences. It's always true. But if we don't have the consequences, if they're not there, then we have no awareness of the damage we might do to ourselves or others. So it's an important part of life, and sometimes it's painful physically and psychologically. So let's look at the world of suffering. Sometimes suffering is there to give us warnings of problems ahead, dangers. We learn. Suffering sometimes is to show that there are consequences for actions. Don't go that way, don't do that. you'll end up with a lot of problems and a lot of trouble, much more serious. But sometimes our own choices, coming from our free will, we have to take decisions that we find uncomfortable and indeed painful, but they're important for the benefit of others and for the welfare of wider society. People say that. And it's hard to take that kind of question on when it's put that way. In fact, if you listen to and talk to people who make statements like that, in fact, that's not the real problem. It's a cover-up for something much deeper. They don't want to contemplate the possibility of God, because if they did contemplate it, it would have implications for their lifestyle that they're currently living. But we have to recognize that most suffering is caused by you and me. Not at all, but the vast majority. And some suffering, as I've shown you, has got advantages. Working with a tool, you cut yourself. There's a bit of blood around the place. You put on a bandage, but the process you learn to handle that tool more carefully, and that may save you losing a finger or a limb or hurting someone else. And the very fact we're aware of suffering, the very fact we're aware of evil in the world, it enhances our desire for justice. And you see this with watching television programs. Anger kind of arises within us when we see the way that people in other parts of the world are sometimes treated. And we want to do something about it. Sadly, too often we don't. But there's more to suffering than just that. It isn't all positive. What about the dreadful destructive illnesses where we see somebody with a progressive illness slowly losing their faculties? Or the kind of natural disasters that appear to be random, where innocent people suffer horrendously, losing loved ones, homes, crops. How about these kind of things? Where is the logic of Christianity when it comes to that? Let's look at our world. It's a wonderfully good world. On any reflection on the way it runs, we couldn't come to any other conclusion, but it does operate on fixed principles. It's underpinned by the laws of probability. Now, that's nothing to do with chance. Laws of probability is something somewhat different. And if the world works within the principles, and if we cooperate with them, it's fine. But if we ignore the principles, if we exploit the principles for our own selfish gains, if we abuse the planet or each other and exploit each other, then there's problems. And part of these problems will be that we bring suffering upon ourselves or upon others. We've got to work within the way we have been made and this world has been made. But there's more to suffering than even that. Yes, our world is wonderful, but something has gone wrong with it. There are powerful spiritual forces. The Bible pictures them in terms of spiritual beings. Angels, but they're opposing God. Most angels work with God and for the benefit of humankind. Spiritual beings. They're trying to mess up God's creation. It's the way of getting at God, if you like. Get at us. And they try to make us suffer. But that's a great truth. God in His graciousness, this is biblical teaching, has put great limits. These powerful spiritual beings are powerful. They can do immense damage, but their powers are limited. And the protection of God is there. If, and there's a big if, we're willing to seek and accept it, and it does require us to have some sort of knowledge about how to seek and accept it. But the whole biblical story pictures that protection again and again and again. And indeed the Lord's Prayer encapsulates it. We're asking God to protect us from the evil one. So there's something more about suffering in the world. Don't know if you ever thought about this. Could you invent or construct a world where there's no suffering? Or where suffering is so limited that no innocent person suffers unfairly? Because if we look out in the world today, it is so often the innocent that suffer unfairly, and it's so often those who don't have, who are not powerful, that suffer the worst. Could we construct a world where that doesn't happen? Supposing you can't do that. If you can't create a world that way, what about those who do suffer, who are innocent, the dispossessed, the poor in society, those the have-nots? What about them? Life is pretty unfair. Life indeed is unfair. And very often the innocent suffer. Well, when we look at creating a world where there is no suffering, then we immediately come against problems related to human freedom. And when we look at the innocent suffering, immediately we come to issues of life after death. Because if this life is all there is to it, then it is totally unfair. And that purely on logical grounds points to there being some sort of existence beyond the grave, where the wrongs are put right. Very fundamental and deep questions these. Let's just take it a fraction further. Imagine. Let your brain hang loose, a world where there were no disasters and where God protected everyone all the time. Now just think about what would happen. It would mean that we wouldn't have freedom because it would be reduced to being totally manipulated by God. Didn't matter what we did, God would step in. But given the fact that we do have freedom, we might well do the most horrendous things to ourselves and to others, knowing it doesn't matter, God will sort it out. It removes moral and ethical responsibility. Let's also remember this. If God just intervened so that every natural disaster was averted in some way, then life on this planet would not be the same. You see, most natural disasters are part of the integrated way our world operates, and it actually does it for the benefit of life. Without volcanoes, and there were far more historically, millions and billions of years ago, without volcanoes and earthquakes, then we wouldn't have the planet that is fertile today to support life. Without the operation and moving of plates in the world today, which is part of the reason for earthquakes, then we wouldn't have a planet that could exist the way it exists today. It would be a dead planet. Couldn't support life. So life is not quite as simple as that. Most of the worst outcomes are actually caused by us humans, not by the natural disasters. I'm going to suggest that. The possibility of suffering is a necessary element in God's creation. The way God has made this world, the way that God has made us with free will. If he had made the world in the fixed way where there were no natural disasters, then there would be no life as we know it today. But our free will causes most of the suffering in the world today, and indeed it causes much of the suffering that arises from natural disasters. People set up their crops and their homes on the slopes of active volcanoes. Greed. The land is particularly fertile. We could help them by providing them the resources and equipment so that they could farm a distance away from the volcano. Then they wouldn't be at risk. We know how to build houses that withstand earthquakes. But much of the disaster of earthquakes, and I'm thinking of one country particularly where 80,000 died, it was caused by buildings that broke the country's building regulations, where builders were on the make and didn't use the quality materials, particularly the quality concrete, and it couldn't stand the earthquakes. Lives were lost because of human greed and selfishness. You see, as soon as we've got free will, we've got the possibility to mess up. And we can suffer and others can suffer. There are some consequences. You can't get a world without suffering. Try and think it through, it's impossible. If you do, you lose free will. And you also lose the earth's ability to sustain life. But without some suffering, you don't learn. You don't develop. The child has to be told, no, don't do that, and stopped, because the child could hurt itself or hurt others or go into a delinquent teenage time and perhaps end up as an ardent criminal. But there is life after death. That is in the logic of Christianity. The Bible has a whole book about the life of Job. Job suffered because Satan decided to have a go at him. God restricted Satan. God always does. But Job lost his property and wealth, his family, his health. Can't lose much more than these three. But in the end of the day, God stepped in. Job came through it. And Job got them all back. In fact, he got his family back twice, because the family he lost went on ahead of him into eternity. But he had a second family. So when they all went into eternity, he benefited twice over. But what he went through was horrendous. But their injustices were put right. You see, God's creation has got inbuilt laws, principles if you like, and it applies in the physical world and the spiritual world. Now we've got to work within these physical principles. We develop accordingly. And human beings, by their creativity historically, have done wonders. God has given us a capacity to understand, to harness the physical world for our benefit. And the contributions from the sciences are simply enormous for the benefit of mankind, although sometimes human beings have abused the findings. It's the same in the spiritual world. We've got freedom in both cases. We can choose to work within the way God has made it, or we can choose to mess up and do it our own way, and there are consequences for that. A very deep thought here. God giving us freedom is an act of love. But God took an enormous risk making us the way we are, because things could go wrong. And in our lives they so often do. To suggest that we can reduce or avoid suffering by pretending it's not there That's a delusion. And I think Buddhism gets close to that. To suggest that we can solve our own problems by self-effort, that's a recipe for futility. To suggest that Satan is behind everything evil in the world, it's his fault, not ours, that's a moral cop-out. To suggest that God sends disasters to teach us a lesson, to discipline us, what kind of God would do that? That's an ethical nonsense. And to suggest that disasters are the will of Allah, that Allah, God, has suddenly decided that he'll wipe out 80,000 people. It wasn't their fault the builders built the buildings in ways that wouldn't stand the earthquakes. That totally undermines God's goodness. Is a God who does that worth worshipping? There's a lot of careless thought about suffering in the world today, and religion very often has not helped. It's an inevitable consequence of free will. Most religions accept that. There are the natural events of life and the way this universe and world have been made. But free will leads to our decisions, which can hurt us or others, or decisions of others, which can hurt them or hurt us. The natural events of life, Satan can get into them, causing destruction. And there are the apparently meaningless experiences and tragedies of life that don't make sense. We don't always have answers to them. But God is there for us to take us through them, and God is there to provide protection if we will but seek it. And I bring this presentation to a conclusion, because it comes back to the word grace, God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves, we do not deserve, we cannot earn, and it cost him a lot, like everything. But if we are prepared to come under the umbrella of God's protection, we're protected from being destroyed by the storm. That is the logic of Christianity when it comes to suffering. The next presentation I'm going to look at the implications for our living derived from the logic of Christianity. How does it work out in practice?